year 1816, the year without summer, snow in June across New England, crop failures throughout Europe, famine across the Northern Hemisphere. Ask any historian what caused it, and you'll get the same answer. Mount Tambora, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia in April 1815, the largest in recorded history, ejecting so much ash into the atmosphere that it cooled the entire planet for over a year. That's the official explanation. And for most of my life, I accepted it without question. But I started asking a question that wouldn't leave me alone. What if the volcanic explanation wasn't the full story? I started looking at the evidence, not just the climate data, but everything surrounding that period. The demographic records, the architectural timeline, the massive population movements, the institutional responses. And the deeper I went, the more the volcanic explanation began to collapse under the weight of what it was supposedly explaining. Because here's what we're asked to believe: a single volcanic eruption caused global climate disruption severe enough to trigger mass starvation, unprecedented migration, and fundamental reorganization of social infrastructure across multiple continents. All of this documented, all of this acknowledged, yet somehow this event left behind exactly the kind of evidence you'd expect from something far more catastrophic than a volcano. Let me show you what I mean. The temperature records from 1816 are genuinely disturbing. We're not talking about a mild cooling. We're talking about snowfall in Massachusetts in June, killing frost through July and August, crop failures so severe that they triggered food riots across Europe. But here's where it gets strange. The cooling wasn't uniform. Some regions experienced devastation, while others showed minimal impact. The temperature drops don't follow the atmospheric circulation patterns you'd expect from volcanic ash distribution. The timeline doesn't quite match volcanic cooling models either. The worst effects appeared too quickly after Tambora's eruption, and in some cases, regional climate disruptions began showing up in records before the eruption date. That's not how volcanic winters work. Ash distribution follows predictable atmospheric patterns. Cooling should be gradual and widespread. Recovery should be slow. Yet the 1816 event shows localized severity, abrupt onset, and irregular recovery patterns that atmospheric scientists still struggle to fully explain using only the volcanic model. And that's just the climate data. The real mystery emerges when you look at what happened next. What followed 1816 was unprecedented population movement. Not gradual migration, not economic adjustment, but mass resettlement on a scale that seems impossible for the stated cause. Look at the orphan train movement that began in the decades following. Between 1853 and 1929, over 200,000 children were relocated from eastern cities to rural areas across America. The official explanation: urban overcrowding and poverty. But the scale, the timing, the institutional coordination required, it suggests something more significant than simple economic hardship. These weren't isolated charity efforts. This was systematic redistribution. Children removed from families, placed on trains, sent west in organized waves. The documentation is sparse. Records of origin are often missing. Family histories abruptly terminate. And when you ask why as so many orphans suddenly appeared in eastern cities in the decades after 1816, the official narrative points to industrialization and urban migration. But industrialization doesn't explain the numbers. It doesn't explain the institutional response. It doesn't explain why this particular period saw such concentrated efforts at population redistribution, or why the children often had no documented family history beyond a certain point. The pattern repeats globally. In Europe, massive migration waves followed the 1816 famine. In Russia, population centers shifted. In Asia, demographic records show unexplained gaps and sudden relocations. All of this attributed to economic hardship from crop failures. Yet here's what we're asked to accept. A volcanic eruption caused climate disruption severe enough to trigger the complete reorganization of populations across multiple continents, requiring the creation of new institutions, new infrastructure, and coordinated efforts spanning decades, all to address the aftermath of a natural disaster that officially lasted about 18 months. Once you see the scale of the response, the volcanic explanation begins to feel inadequate. Now, if this were truly just a volcanic winter and subsequent famine, you'd expect to see certain things in the architectural record: gradual adaptation, regional variation, economic constraints visible in construction, structures built to address specific agricultural failures. That's not what you find. What you find instead are massive institutional buildings appearing in waves during the post-1816 period. Orphanages, asylums, reformatories, workhouses, all built with remarkable uniformity, all appearing within a compressed time frame, all displaying architectural features that suggest purposes beyond their official function. These weren't simple shelters. They were engineered structures, reinforced foundations, standardized layouts, capacity far exceeding stated need. And they appear simultaneously across different regions, different countries, different continents, all supposedly responding independently to the same climate disaster. The construction itself raises questions. Where did the resources come from during a period of supposed economic devastation? How was such building coordinated during a time of famine? Why do the structures show architectural continuity with earlier construction techniques that official history claims were lost or forgotten? And here's the strangest part. Many of these buildings incorporate design elements, heating systems, ventilation, structural reinforcement, that seem engineered for scenarios beyond housing displaced populations. They appear built to protect occupants from something environmental, something external. This is where the official narrative truly breaks down, because what we're looking at isn't isolated regional responses to local disasters. We're looking at globally coordinated institutional reorganization happening simultaneously across disconnected regions. The orphan trains in America, the workhouse system expansion in Britain, the asylum construction boom across Europe, the population redistributions in Russia, all of this happening within the same compressed time frame, all of it attributed to responses to the same volcanic winter. But coordination on this scale requires communication infrastructure, transportation networks, institutional frameworks, and centralized planning that officially didn't exist yet. The telegraph wasn't widely deployed, international coordination was limited. Yet somehow disparate governments and institutions all responded to the 1816 climate disaster with nearly identical solutions: mass institutional construction and systematic population redistribution. Ask yourself, how does that happen? How do isolated regions develop identical responses to a global disaster without the infrastructure to coordinate such efforts? How do you explain the architectural uniformity, the institutional similarity, the synchronized timing, unless of course the coordination already existed, unless the infrastructure was already in place, unless what we're seeing isn't independent responses to a disaster, but rather a coordinated response to something that required global management? And that's where the nuclear winter hypothesis becomes impossible to ignore. I want to be very careful here. I'm not making definitive claims, I'm presenting evidence and asking questions. A nuclear winter produces specific atmospheric effects: rapid temperature drops, irregular cooling patterns based on blast distribution rather than atmospheric circulation, localized severity, environmental disruption requiring institutional response and population protection. The 1816 climate data fits these patterns better than it fits standard volcanic models. Now consider what a large-scale nuclear exchange would require in terms of aftermath management: immediate population redistribution away from affected zones, mass institutional construction to house displaced populations, systematic reorganization of social infrastructure, erasure of pre-disaster records to prevent panic, creation of alternative explanations for the environmental disruption. Look at the evidence. Mass population movements following 1816. unprecedented institutional construction, orphan waves requiring systematic redistribution, architectural features suggesting environmental protection, global coordination during a period of supposed isolation. Climate patterns inconsistent with purely volcanic causation, all of this officially explained as response to a volcano. But volcanic winters don't require orphan trains. They don't require the construction of fortified institutions with environmental protection features. They don't require the systematic erasure of population records or the redistribution of children whose family histories terminate abruptly. Nuclear catastrophe does. If you're finding this investigation valuable, I encourage you to examine the primary sources yourself. The climate data is available. The institutional records exist. The architectural evidence can be studied. Don't take my word for it. Look at what the evidence actually shows. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Because if we're looking at evidence of large-scale catastrophe requiring global response, we need to ask, catastrophe of what? Destruction of what civilization or infrastructure would require this level of coordinated aftermath management? This is where the Tartarian hypothesis enters the investigation. Look at pre-1816 maps. Look at architectural surveys. Look at the structures that survived into the modern era. There's evidence of sophisticated infrastructure, advanced construction techniques, and coordinated urban planning that predates the official Industrial Revolution. Buildings displaying engineering precision that shouldn't exist yet. Cities laid out with mathematical precision. Infrastructure suggesting centralized planning. Then look at what happens after 1816. Sudden gaps in architectural records. Structures attributed to earlier periods but showing construction techniques from later eras. Missing documentation. Abrupt transitions in building styles. And everywhere, institutions designed to manage displaced populations. What if 1816 wasn't just a climate disaster? What if it marked the destruction or collapse of existing infrastructure on a scale requiring complete social reorganization? What if the orphan trains weren't moving children displaced by famine, but rather survivors of something that destroyed entire population centers? The nuclear winter hypothesis provides a mechanism: advanced civilization possessing weapons technology, catastrophic exchange or accident, global environmental disruption, surviving infrastructure requiring either destruction or conversion to new purposes, populations requiring redistribution and institutional management, and then the creation of an alternative narrative, a volcanic eruption, a natural disaster, something comprehensible, something that doesn't require explaining how advanced weapons technology existed in the early 19th century. Let's return to those orphan trains. Because once you start asking deeper questions, the official explanation becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. Over 200,000 children, systematically relocated, often with no documented family history, placed with families in rural areas, away from urban centres, away from the regions most affected by the supposed climate disaster. We're told these were children displaced by urban poverty following the 1816 famine. But the timing doesn't work. The orphan train movement didn't peak until decades after 1816. If this was simply famine response, why the delayed institutional response? Why did the programs continue for nearly 80 years? And why were the records so incomplete? Why do so many of these children have no documented origin? Why are family histories so often truncated at a specific point, unless these weren't orphans from poverty? Unless they were survivors of something that destroyed their communities entirely? Unless they were being moved away from areas that remained dangerous, or that contained evidence of what actually happened? The pattern suggests systematic relocation away from specific zones. The institutional response suggests management of a population that couldn't remain in place. The architectural evidence suggests preparation for environmental threats that extended beyond temporary climate disruption. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's what disturbs me most: the complete absence of alternative explanations in official histories. the uniformity of the volcanic narrative, the lack of contemporary questioning about the scale of institutional response. Think about it. A volcanic eruption causes climate disruption that triggers the construction of thousands of institutions, the relocation of hundreds of thousands of people, the reorganization of social infrastructure across continents, and the systematic redistribution of children whose family records often don't exist, and no one questioned whether the response matched the cause. The silence was deafening, and it remains so today. Mention nuclear winter in the context of 1816 and you're dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Point out the coordination problem and you're told it was just effective response to crisis. Question the orphan records and you're accused of being insensitive to historical poverty. But the questions remain, the evidence remains, the patterns remain. Why did a volcanic winter require orphan trains? Why did climate disruption necessitate fortified institutional construction with environmental protection features? Why did population redistribution continue for decades after the climate recovered? Why are the records incomplete? Why is the architectural timeline inconsistent? Why does the coordination exceed the stated communication infrastructure? These aren't radical questions. They're basic observations about documented evidence. In the end, what haunts me most isn't what happened. It's what we're not allowed to know happened. If 1816 marked the destruction or collapse of advanced infrastructure, if it represented catastrophe on a scale requiring complete social reorganization, if it necessitated the creation of an alternative historical narrative, then what knowledge was lost? For decades following the climate disruption, we see humanity struggling to reconstruct techniques that earlier records suggest were already mastered. By the 1850s, when industrial development supposedly hit its stride, we weren't inventing new methods. We were rediscovering old ones. The precision manufacturing, the advanced metallurgy, the sophisticated construction techniques, they all appear in fragments before 1816. After 1816, they slowly re-emerge as if being pieced back together. That's not progress, that's recovery. And if it was recovery, what was lost? What knowledge existed before the break that took generations to reconstruct? What capabilities did the pre-1816 world possess that we only regained through decades of effort? The architectural evidence provides clues. Acoustic engineering in buildings supposedly constructed before the science existed. Precise astronomical alignments in structures attributed to scientifically illiterate colonial labourers. Load-bearing systems that exceed functional requirements, suggesting knowledge of forces not formally understood until much later. These weren't primitive people guessing correctly. These were structures built by people who understood principles we're told they couldn't have known. And then 1816 happened, whatever it was, whatever the true cause. And that knowledge fractured, scattered, preserved in physical remnants but lost in practical application. And the orphan trains suggest something even darker. The systematic removal of witnesses, the relocation of survivors, the erasure of memory through displacement and institutional control. I can't prove definitively what caused the year without summer. I can't prove nuclear exchange destroyed a previous civilization. I can't prove the Tartarian hypothesis, but I can show you the evidence. I can point out the patterns. I can ask the questions that official history refuses to address. The deeper I looked, the less the volcanic explanation held together. Not because volcanoes can't affect climate, they can, but because the response to 1816 goes so far beyond what volcanic winter would require. It suggests something larger, something that needed to be managed, hidden, explained away. The evidence suggests something much larger than we've been told, and that's perhaps the most disturbing realization of all. Not what happened, not when it happened, not even how it happened, but that it could be hidden so completely for so long behind a story just plausible enough that most people never think to question it. The year without summer, a volcanic winter, a natural disaster. The question isn't whether something happened beyond the official narrative. The evidence makes that almost certain. The question is what exactly, We're still not being told about the world before 1816 and what was lost or hidden when that world ended.